Alrighty, CNT125, welcome to our lab room. This podcast, I'm going to talk a little bit about your lab station, how it's set up, where things are located. That when you get to the lab room, you kind of can hit the ground running and know what you need to do. Alright, first thing you'll notice, we have a lab table here with two workstations, and there's a rack of equipment at the end of the rack, or a rack of equipment, lab equipment at the end of the table for you. There's another table on the other side with two workstations that's going to share this equipment rack as well. So when you come into the lab room and sit down, first thing you want to do is kind of orient yourself. These are the two computers you'll be using for labs throughout the semester. At the end of the table is your equipment rack, and there is a set of equipment on the top and essentially a duplicate set of equipment on the bottom. If you look at the corner of the table, I have a sticker here that tells you which half of the rack you should be using. The table I'm sitting at right now, this sticker over here says use the top half of the equipment rack. That top half of the equipment rack has all the important ports pointing towards you. So as you work on your labs, you'll be able to see those ports, those link lights, those activity lights as you're working. The other side of the lab table, lab partner will be sitting there. They'll be using the bottom half of the rack because all the important ports will be pointing towards them that they can see the blinky link lights, etc. So here's my lab station, my two workstations I'll be using for labs, and where I'm sitting I'll be using the top half of the rack. When you come into the lab room, you'll want to boot up your PCs. The PCs are actually hooked to a power strip under the table. We leave that on. We don't need to shut that off. We'll just shut the computers off when we're done using them. The equipment rack, the routers and switches in the rack, will not be powered on. So you'll need to power those on when you come into the lab room. Every lab equipment rack has two power strips. In this lab, both the power strips, the power buttons are facing me, if you will. The other lab room, I think there's one facing one half of the rack, the other one facing the other half of the rack. But you'll need to turn both of those on to get all the equipment in the rack powered on. So if you're the first person at the table, you might want to hit both switches and kind of get things booted up for you. As you leave the lab room, the last person at the table will want to power those down. That way they're not on for 2 or 3 days till somebody's in here in the lab room again. So I come in the lab room, I'll boot my two computers, I'll boot my equipment rack and let them boot, and now I can actually start using my setup here. So the way this is set up, these two computers will be using for labs. The two computers on the other side, your lab partner will be using for doing their lab. And as I look here, I'm going to turn this just a little bit. As I look at my equipment rack, and I'll tilt this up just a little bit. Like I said, the power strips are in the middle. You need to make sure you turn those on. There's a big panel in the middle that has a couple outlet boxes on. There's one outlet box that says on it internet or hacker internet. That is the kind of the default location we should be leaving our patch cables so we have connection to the college/internet. Okay? There is two other outlet boxes. One that is for connection inside the room. I believe on this rack, it's this one here. It says room network. That actually goes to an equipment rack at the side of the room that we use for special labs throughout the year. The other outlet box in this room has on it CNT140. That is an outlet box that the cabling students in the CNT140 class cable throughout the semester. Pull the cabling to, terminate the outlet, etc., etc. So first thing I want to make sure is if I need internet connection, I'm in the internet box. When I'm done with lab, I want to make sure my patch cables are back into that box as well. Okay, so my two lab stations in this case, if I look at them, the sticker on the CPU here indicates it's Fa24, which is the lab room we're in right now, and below it says CNT02. That's computer number 2. As I look over here, Fa24, CNT01. This is the computer over here on the right is computer 1. I'm mentioning that because we'll need to find our computers and their patch cables. If I look at these patch cables, they're labeled by computer number. So I would need to take computer 1 and 2 and move them into the switch ports that I'm going to use for my lab. So I might actually do this when I come in. I locate my computer 1, computer 2, unplug these patch cables. They're connected directly to those PCs, and then I can put them in the switch ports I need to for my labs. Okay? I'm going to put them back here for now, but I might need to do that as I start a lab. Locate the patch cables for my PC, and then plug them in appropriately to my switches and routers. Alright, with that in mind, let's take a look at the equipment rack. My top half of the rack I have, let me do this here real quick. Here we go. On the top half of my equipment rack, I have 2 switches up here that we'll be using for many, many labs. These will end up connecting into, configuring, putting VLANs on, those sorts of things. These will be my switches for my labs. Right below it, we have 2 routers. We have a 4221 router, which is newer, and a 2811 router, which is a little older. These are 2 workhorse commercial routers that we'll be using for pretty much all of our labs this semester. This is pretty much my equipment for the labs we're going to be doing in here in 125. These are some older pieces of equipment that are eventually going to go away. I'm going to be replacing them with a newer switch and a newer router as well, especially as this school year goes along. So here would be the lab equipment that this lab station will be using. The other side of the table, their lab equipment will be down here. And you'll end up seeing duplicate 2 of the same switches, and down here 2 of the same routers that you'd have that we're looking at over here. So there real quickly is kind of my lab station where things are located. The other thing we'll need to pay attention to is on these computers, we will need to be connecting into routers and switches to configure them. Well, our routers and switches are not like our homeowner routers and switches. Our homeowner routers and switches, we browse into them to configure them. Here, it doesn't work that way. Our commercial routers and switches, let me zoom over here a little bit. If I look a little closer at these guys, I'll tilt down a little bit. Here is the back of the switches for my lab partner. What I find, there's a power cord on. Let me get a couple of these cords out of the way. There's a power cord in here on the right. And the only other port on the back of this thing is this thing over here called a console port. That is how we're actually going to connect into and configure this switch, and for that matter, the routers as well. They don't have a monitor, keyboard, and mouse port, so we can't plug in that way to work on them. So we have to use our desktop that has a monitor, keyboard, and mouse, and send commands from here over to the switch. The switch will execute them and display the results back here. And we do that through the use of a console cable. These blue console cables are located at the side of the lab room. There's a rack at the side of the lab room that has a whole bunch of these on. This is the cable we'll need to connect from our computer into the router and switch. Well, that cable, if you look at it a little closer, it has an RJ45 connector. This is the part that'll plug into the switch or router, and I'm just going to do this here as an example. And the other end is a serial connection. Okay, that serial connection plugs into the back of my PC. Well, older PCs had serial ports built in, and actually these PCs do as well. But we're going to use a newer style of connection. This is the kind of thing you would use on either a newer computer or maybe a laptop. This is what's called a USB. Here's a USB end to serial port adapter. This guy right here. So the USB will plug into my PC, any open USB port, doesn't matter which one. And then this over here gives me a serial port that I can use to plug my console cable into. Okay, this will just plug in like so. Now, these are already attached to your PC. Every lab station, the PC that's closest to the equipment rack has this already installed on. Here's this one right here. Okay, so every lab station, the PC that's closest to the equipment rack has this installed. You only need one at your table. You don't need 2. 1 is fine. This is the connection we will use for our console cable to connect into our routers and switches. Okay, that's what we'll end up using to connect into the routers and switches to configure them for the semester, using that USB to serial port adapter. Okay, and all we'll need to do is, again, when we come into the lab room, we will get one of the console cables, these blue console cables, off the equipment rack at the side of the room. Okay, the equipment rack at the side of the room has these in, and it also has in, let me rotate here a little bit. Rotate. Okay, here is our room equipment rack. Okay. Here is the rack of console cables. You'll also notice that it has short black patch cables and short orange patch cables. Okay. The short black patch cables are straight through patch cables we'll use to connect unlike devices, switch to router, switch to PC kind of thing. These short orange patch cables are crossover. Those will get used to connect like devices, switch to switch or router to router. Okay. So we have over here straight through for connecting unlike devices, crossover for connecting like devices, and we have console for connecting into the routers and switches for configuration purposes. So when I come in the lab room, I might want to get the necessary cables on the way by to go to my lab station, especially my console cable. Okay, so let me rotate back over here to my lab station. Okay, so as I come in the lab room, I would get my patch cables, including one of my console cables. And all I'll need to do when I need to configure the routers and switches, I'll get my console cable. I will plug it into my USB to serial port adapter and make sure it is mine. I'll follow it back there and make sure it is. Plug in here. I don't need to screw it tight or anything. I can just plug it in, lay it here. And then this will plug into the router switch I want to configure. Let's say I do want to configure. I'm going to go to, on my lab table here, the top equipment is the stuff I'll be configuring. Let's say I want to configure the top switch. I will just take my console cable. Let me get my microphone cable out of the way. Here we go. I'll take my console cable and I'm going to plug it into the console port on the back of the switch. That's where it's going to be located. If I want to configure the bottom router, again, I plug it into the console port in the back. If I want to configure this router here, the console port's actually on the front, and it says console, and it actually does have blue lettering to match the blue patch cable. I would just plug it in, and now I would be set to be able to send commands from the computer to the router send the results back to my screen. Okay, so there is a quick overview of our lab equipment, our lab station, if you will. Both labs are set up pretty much identical. The equipment is pretty much identical locations. Same with the workstations. The workstations are Windows 10, and they have a generic admin account on called CNT Student, and the password is CNT Class. We have that on the board. I'll remind you when you get to the lab room as well. The password is CNT Class. It will be helpful in here when you do labs, when you're done, to save your files onto something like your Google Drive. That way you have them in case there's an issue. After you submit your files to D2L, I'd put a copy in a little folder on your Google Drive. Maybe create a CNT125 folder, create a lab folder, and maybe create little folders for each lab you do. You know, the routing and switch, routing protocol lab, put the files in there. The VLAN lab, put the files in there. That way you have copies of them. If you want to use a USB drive to save them as well, you can do that. I just tend to do it on my Google Drive. That way I can save it here and also get to it from home. That would be the only other suggestion. As far as lab equipment, we have everything you need. There's no special supplies you need. We have the cables, we have the computers, router switches, all that kind of good stuff. You just want to make sure you have a place to save your files. You might also want to, let me get my sample out here. I have over the years used a basic composition book, and I use that to take notes in about configuration. Let me roll here to, here is, this will be kind of scribbly, but here are some configuration commands for access lists on the router. So I would just take a page and put down those commands that I have them for reference for later. You might want to do that as you start configuring things in the lab room. Here's some switch config stuff. That way you have your own notebook of configuration that you can build over the semester and then use it in future classes as well as use it on your job. This can be handy for you in the long run. Alrighty, that is a quick orientation of our lab room. The next podcast, I'll show you how to specifically use the computer to console into the routers and switches.